So now let's go back and discuss this phrase, they race to its wall. In Nahum chapter 2, verse 5. The walls are in the feminine in the Hebrew. And this leads John D.W. Watts to suggest that Ishtar, the goddess of Nineveh, could be in view. And he believes that Ishtar is being referred to frequently throughout Nahum. Most scholars take the feminine language to speak of the city itself, but Watts believes it could also be referring to the goddess. He first mentions this in Nahum chapter 1, verse 8, and connects it to what we're looking at here in verse 5 through 7. And he says, quote, "This feminine pronoun may stand for Nineveh, but it also may point to her patron goddess Ishtar, and even beyond Ishtar to the Creator's great enemy who represents chaos in the creation epic. God's vengeance promises to end the enemy, whether on the level of history or on that above history. Those who stand with her as demonic allies are also God's enemies," end quote. Watts goes on to refer to these enemies as Belial, and then he says, quote, "They are to be pursued into darkness. This is the darkness of the underworld, the world of death and demons where they belong," end quote. So I think Watts's his suggestion here is very interesting. I think it makes a lot of sense to identify Ishtar here with what's going on in Nahum chapter 2 and also chapter 3. I think it's pretty clear in chapter 3 that Ishtar is in view, and so it makes a lot of sense what Watts is saying here about Ishtar being the one referred to in chapter 1, verse 8 and onward, when we see this feminine grammar being used. So who is Ishtar? Ishtar was the most famous goddess of the Assyrian period. She's much more ancient than Assyria, worshipped in Mesopotamia. Ishtar is the goddess of sexual love as well as a war goddess. She is called the Queen of Heaven. She personifies the battle line. She's the patroness of prostitutes and is herself called a prostitute in some of the texts. And sacred prostitution involved temple priestesses of Ishtar having ritual sex with male visitors to the temple. And this wasn't just done in Babylon and Assyria, but this is done in the Greek and Roman period as well. Paul talks to the Corinthians about this kind of thing when they were involved in some things they ought not to have been. And scholars link Ishtar with Aphrodite, Aphrodite being the goddess of love. They believe that Aphrodite was one of the later manifestations of Ishtar. And also Inanna was the manifestation of Ishtar prior. So Inanna was the same, or is the same as Ishtar. And according to Herodotus, going back to this idea of Ishtar as the patroness of the prostitutes, according to Herodotus, the Greek historian, every Babylonian woman was required at least once in her lifetime to attend the temple of Ishtar and agree to sex with any male that asked her. Ishtar is also the spouse and lover of the king with whom she participates in the ritual of sacred marriage. So sacred marriage is the act or the ritual in which the high priestess of Ishtar, or possibly Ishtar herself, we'll talk a little bit about that when we in a second. So the high priestess of Ishtar, or possibly Ishtar herself, would have ritual sex with the king. It's believed that this ritual took place yearly during the Babylonian New Year's festival of Akitu. And the surviving royal hymns and inscriptions reporting the ritual refer in very explicit language to the passionate sexual affair between the king and the goddess Inanna, which, as I mentioned, is another name for Ishtar. Now, Ishtar also provides the king with economic blessings as well as power and victory in war. And in Assyria, she was the goddess of war and victory. She also seems to have been a gender-fluid goddess. One hymn quotes Inanna/Ishtar as saying, quote, "When I sit in the alehouse, I am a woman, and I am an exuberant young man," end quote. And according to Gary Beckman, who's a noted Hittitologist and professor of Hittite and Mesopotamian studies from the University of Michigan, the ambiguous gender identification was a characteristic not just of Ishtar herself, but of a category of deities that he calls Ishtar-type goddesses. Ishtar is also a goddess of sorcery, as we'll see when we get to Nahum chapter 3, verse 4. And at that point, we'll have to discuss this in more detail, as that's directly links to Mystery Babylon, the great horror of Revelation 17 and 18. So there is a link between Ishtar, the prostitute, the sorceress, and Mystery Babylon, the woman that rides the beast. But we'll look at that when we get to Nahum chapter 3, because that's when it's going to be blatantly and clearly brought out by Nahum. So to end this little section here on Ishtar, I'm going to quote Watts again. He says, quote, "She," speaking of Ishtar, "was a most fitting symbol for the brutal empire. With lustful visions of riches and power, Ishtar had beguiled nations into war and conquest. Like the devil, she tempted and demonized all who came within her sphere of influence," end quote. And the description of the goddess sounds very much like the description of Nineveh itself, especially when we bring in what we're reading today with what we're going to see in chapter 3. The people of Assyria who worshipped Ishtar became like the goddess they worshipped, and they then received the same judgment. And Watts here says, quote, "The figure of the lion is particularly good for the overtones of supernatural conflict in the book. Ishtar was often pictured mounted on a lion's back, or even herself as a lioness," end quote. And so, as Christensen before referenced the verse, but he didn't quote it, I'm going to read it here, and it's 1 Peter 5:8. As it says, "Your adversary the devil is prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for anyone he can devour." And interestingly, there was a lioness deity worshipped in the second half of the 2nd century BC in Ugarit in southwest Canaan. And this war goddess was the patroness of chariot warriors. And we also, as we looked at, we saw earlier in this chapter of Nahum, the idea of chariot warriors. So this war goddess was the patroness of chariot warriors and is also associated with lions. And in Mesopotamia later, this goddess is Ishtar. So by the time of Nahum, this lioness deity was Ishtar. And the lioness symbolizes the military character of Ishtar. And Theodore J. Lewis, in his article, I'm going to give you the article title here, and it's CT 13.33-34 and Ezekiel 32, Lion Dragon Myths. So that's the title of this article by Theodore J. Lewis. And in that article, he says, quote, "Ishtar is the deity most frequently associated with the lion. Labatu, lioness, occurs as her epithet alone. She is the lioness among the Agigi. She drives 7 lions in her war chariot. These 7 lions are called the symbol of her divinity. Her iconography shows her seated on a lion throne and standing or treading upon the lion," end quote. And he said there that Ishtar is the lioness among the Agigi, and the Agigi were a group of Mesopotamian gods. So that's what that means, and that's what that is that he's quoting there. And there's also an interesting verse in 2 Samuel 23:20. In which Benaiah, one of David's mighty men, is said to have killed 2, quote, Ariels of Moab. And scholars aren't sure what this means. The King James translates it as 2 lion-like men of Moab. The ESV just transliterates the word and says that he killed 2 Ariels of Moab. The literal translation would be something like lions of God. And there's an entry in the Dictionary of Deities and Demons on this word, Ariels. And they say in part, quote, "Ariel here designates some kind of person, be it a warrior or a mythic figure," end quote. And then they go on, and I'm just going to summarize the rest of, paraphrase it a bit here. There was a bronze-silver figure found in the Transjordan, and I believe that discovery was in the early to mid-90s, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But this figure, according to the excavator, represents a male lion-faced warrior, possibly a warrior god. There's an inscription known as the Misha inscription, and one of the lines on this inscription could be translated, quote, "the lion figure of their beloved god," according to scholar J.C.L. Gibson. And Ninurta, who is another of the Mesopotamian deities, who, by the way, rode on a chimera beast that had the body of a lion and the tail of a scorpion. So if that sounds like Book of Revelation imagery to you, it sure does to me. But Ninurta is said in one of the texts to have taken on the features of the exceedingly mighty lion-headed one of Enlil. So I say all that, I go through those things about the lion gods and goddesses. I say all that in order to say that these verses about lions and lionesses very well could be pronouncements of doom by Yahweh upon these rebel gods. And I do think that's what's being communicated here by Nahum.